Feeling like you're trying to build a Lego castle, but everyone keeps swapping out the instructions on you.
Yeah.
That often feels like the reality of managing teams, right?
Yeah.
Navigating all the organizational complexity, especially maybe if you're stepping up into a new role or things are just shifting all around you.
It's definitely a common feeling. Facing those challenges of leading engineering teams, it often feels pretty unstructured. Finding reliable, practical guidance can seem, well, almost impossible sometimes.
Exactly. And that's precisely why today we're diving deep into Will Larson's An Elegant Puzzle, Systems of Engineering Management.
Mm-hmm.
Think of this as your backstage pass. We want to give you the core strategies for effective engineering leadership, but without you having to wade through hundreds of pages yourself.
Yeah, cut right to the chase.
Our mission here is really to pull out those crucial frameworks, the actionable insights that you can hopefully use right away.
And Larson's insights, they aren't just, academic theories. He's bringing a ton of real-world experience from his time at places like Dig, Uber, Stripe.
Right. Big names, complex places.
Exactly. So it's a really grounded perspective on the day-to-day stuff, managing engineering teams, especially at scale.
Yeah. And this book, it tackles, well, everything. From that seemingly simple question of how big should my team be, all the way to the really thorny areas like technical debt or planning for the future with succession.
It covered a lot of ground.
So we're your guides today, ready to unpack all this really valuable material and focus on what's going to actually make a difference for you. Okay, so with this elegant puzzle laid out, where should we start?
Well, let's begin right at the foundation, the organization itself. Larson starts with a really fundamental truth, actually. An organization is just people working together towards some shared goal.
Simple enough.
Right. But while every organization functions somehow, organizational design is about understanding why some really flourish while others just seem to struggle.
Okay, so organizational design isn't just drawing org charts then. It's about making things actually, work better.
Yeah, precisely. Larson actually describes it as living somewhere between process, which is often quick, relatively cheap to implement, and culture, which, well, that evolves much more slowly.
Right.
And has a much more permanent feel.
Mm-hmm.
Good organizational design helps shape how people can collaborate effectively, especially in those situations where just having a process isn't enough, but waiting for the culture to shift just isn't practical.
Got it. So it's about being intentional in how you structure things to get hopefully better results. And a really key part of that structure has got to be team sizing. That feels like something everyone wonders about. Is my team the right size?
Absolutely. Larson argues it's one of the most fundamental challenges, actually, in organizational design, just getting team sizes right. And he offers some guiding principles, based on his experience.
Okay.
So for managers directly overseeing engineers, the individual contributors, he suggests aiming for a span of about 6 to 8 people.
6 to 8. Huh. That's pretty specific. What's the thinking behind that number?
Well, the rationale is that this size, it gives managers enough bandwidth for effective coaching, for coordinating what the team's doing, but also engaging in strategic work planning, leading change, that kind of thing.
Okay.
He contrasts this with what he calls tech lead managers, or TLMs. They often manage fewer than 4 engineers, and they can end up sort of splitting their focus. It potentially limits their growth either in management or in tech leadership.
Yeah, I can see that. Hard to go deep on both.
Right. And then on the other hand, if you have managers with, say, more than 8 direct reports, they just risk becoming overwhelmed. They might lack the capacity for really deep engagement with each person in their work.
That makes a lot of sense, finding that sweet spot for actual support. So what about the next level up? Managers managing other managers.
Yeah, for managers of managers, Larson recommends a slightly smaller span, maybe 4 to 6 managers reporting to them.
Okay, smaller. Why?
The reasoning is kind of similar, actually. It allows enough time for coaching their direct reports, who are managers themselves, and ensuring alignment across the different teams they oversee, plus investing in those broader organizational initiatives.
Right.
Again, fewer than 4 might mean the role isn't quite fully formed yet, or maybe they're still ramping up. But overseeing more than 6 can really stretch their capacity for effective support and that bigger picture strategic thinking.
Okay, so different levels, different recommended ranges. What about on-call rotations? That's a pain point I hear about constantly.
Oh, yeah. Larson has a rule of thumb for that, too. For sustainable 24/7 support, assuming like a 2-tier system, he suggests aiming for on-call rotations with around 8 engineers.
8 for on-call. Okay.
Yeah. He does acknowledge that, shared rotations where multiple teams kind of pool their engineers, that can be a temporary fix sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
But he cautions against it as a long-term strategy. Why? Because engineers often find it significantly more stressful being on call for systems they're not deeply familiar with.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, getting paged at 3 a.m. for something you barely recognize, no fun at all.
Huh.
Right. Now, what about the other end of the scale? Small teams. Larson says teams with fewer than 4 members aren't really like true teams. Why is that?
His argument there is that teams smaller than 4 tend to be what he calls a leaky abstraction.
Leaky abstraction. What does that mean?
It means it becomes really hard to predict their collective output without knowing the specifics of each individual member, like who's available today, who's on call, who's on vacation.
Ah, okay. The team doesn't hide the individual complexities.
Exactly. And they're also more fragile. Losing just one person can drastically impact their capacity. It might shift them from, say, working on new features to just barely keeping the lights on, like trying to plan a group trip with only 2 people. If one gets sick, the whole plan falls apart.
Right, unlike a bigger group where one person being out is less disruptive. Okay, so that sweet spot really seems to be around 6 to 8 for a stable team. He even talks about a playbook for growth. What's that about?
Yeah, the playbook is actually quite straightforward. In a steady state, aim for teams of 6 to 8.
Okay.
When you need to create a new team, the way he recommends doing it is to grow an existing team up to maybe 8 to 10 members, and then split it into 2 new teams of, say, 4 or 5 each.
Ah, budding.
Exactly, budding. And he stresses 2 really key principles here. Never create completely empty teams from scratch, and never leave managers supporting more than 8 individuals for any length of time.
These sound like pretty firm guidelines, but he does frame them as guidelines for thinking, right? Not like hard and fast rules you can never break.
Exactly. Context always matters, of course, and there will definitely be exceptions. But he warns that those exceptions often come with these long-term costs that might not be immediately obvious. It's really about understanding the fundamental reasons behind the guidelines before you decide to deviate.
Okay, so we have some principles for structuring teams. Good start. But what happens once those teams are actually up and running? How do we keep them performing well? Especially, when the organization is growing or changing.
Yeah, this leads right into his discussion of staying on the path to high-performing teams. And he introduces this really useful framework based on 4 distinct states a team can find itself in.
4 states, okay.
Yeah. Falling behind, treading water, repaying debt, and innovating. And understanding which state your team is in is kind of the first step to applying the right fix for sustainable improvement.
These sound pretty intuitive, but let's break them down. What does a team falling behind actually look like?
Okay, so a team is falling behind if their backlog of work is just consistently growing week after week. People are probably working really hard, but they're just not making significant headway. User satisfaction is probably pretty low.
Right. Spinning wheels.
Exactly. Then treading water means they're managing to get the most critical stuff done, the absolute must-dos, but they're not able really to address underlying technical debt or start any new forward-looking projects. Morale might be a bit better than falling behind, but users have probably adjusted their expectations downwards.
Okay. Keeping afloat, barely.
Then a team repaying debt is actively working to reduce their technical debt. And the cool thing here is that reducing debt starts to free up more time, which lets them tackle even more debt. It's a positive cycle.
Ah, the virtuous cycle. Nice.
And finally, an innovating team. They've got a sustainable level of low technical debt, morale is usually high, and they're primarily focused on meeting new user needs, pushing boundaries, building cool new things.
Okay, so the ideal path is obviously moving teams from falling behind towards innovating, but, things happen, teams slip back. For each state, Larson suggests a specific system fix and also some tactical support. Let's start with that team that's falling behind. What's the fundamental fix there?
The core system fix, the big lever for a team falling behind, is simple. Increase their capacity. Hire more people until they reach at least a state of treading water.
Just hire more.
Well, importantly, he emphasizes this means adding net new headcount to the company. He's pretty skeptical about just trying to shuffle existing engineers around, mainly because skills are often specialized and it can cause a lot of internal disruption.
Right, robbing Peter to pay Paul doesn't always work.
Exactly. And then tactically, on the ground, the managers should focus on setting realistic expectations with stakeholders can't promise the moon. Find some quick wins to build momentum and boost morale. And, crucially, maintain an optimistic outlook within the team.
Okay, that makes sense. More capacity is the system fix. What about a team that's treading water? They're keeping things afloat, but like you said, not much else.
Yeah, for a team treading water, the system fix is to consolidate their efforts. They
Yeah.
need to actively reduce the amount of work they have in progress at any one time. WIP reduction, basically.
Focus, finish things.
Precisely. This allows them to actually finish things, build momentum, and eventually start chipping away at their technical debt.
Hmm.
Tactically, the focus for the manager shifts to encouraging individuals to think beyond just their own tasks. It's about adopting a team-level view of productivity, emphasizing collective output over just individual to-do lists.
And when a team finally starts repaying that debt, making progress, what's the key system level change then?
The system fix here is straightforward, but it's absolutely crucial. You have to allocate dedicated time for debt repayment. The team is likely functioning okay. They just need that protected space, that time, for the compounding benefits of reducing tech debt to really kick in over time.
So, carving out the time explicitly.
Yes. And tactically, the manager's job is tricky here. They need to find ways to continue supporting users while the team is focused on this internal work. And that means carefully managing stakeholder expectations, because stakeholders might be getting impatient for new features, especially if the team has a history of falling behind.
Yeah, that's a tough balancing act. Okay, finally, the goal state. Innovating. How do you maintain that from a systems perspective?
The system fix for an innovating team is basically to ensure they maintain sufficient slack in their schedules and their workload.
Slack, like intentionally not being 100% busy.
Exactly. This allows them to build quality into their work right from the start, continue to innovate effectively, and importantly, avoid accumulating new technical debt that drags them back down. Tactically, it's really vital to make sure that the team's innovative work is actually recognized and valued by the organization.
Yeah.
You want to prevent it from being seen as just, non-essential science project.
Right, because that could lead to losing resources or support down the line.
For sure.
It sounds like these system fixes are the underlying structural changes needed, while the tactical support is more about navigating the day-to-day realities within that state. And Larson really stresses these are gradual improvements, but lasting ones, yeah.
Precisely, because these team states, they often reflect months, maybe even years, of accumulated factors, technical debt, process issues, whatever. So the solutions, naturally, they take time to have a real impact. You can't fix it overnight. But the upside is, once these improvements are established, they tend to be quite durable. The big challenge for leaders, though, is maintaining faith in the process, both their own belief and fostering that belief within the rest of the organization, who might want faster results.
Yeah, patience is key. He also talks about focusing efforts rather than spreading resources too thinly, especially during growth. Can you unpack that idea a bit?
Yeah, he uses this analogy. It's kind of like investment returns. If you spread your limited resources, budget, hiring slots, whatever, across many different projects or teams, you might see a little bit of initial progress everywhere.
Seems reasonable.
But the overall return across all of them will likely be lower in the long run compared to concentrating that investment, especially when it comes to real constraints, like hiring engineers. By focusing your hiring effort on one team at a time, that team can actually absorb the new people, get them productive, progress more effectively, and ultimately achieve a higher overall impact for the org. This often means having periods of, say, rapid growth for one specific team, followed by these necessary gelling periods where the now larger team can consolidate and really build cohesion before you maybe shift focus elsewhere.
Interesting. But that brings up a point, right? Once a team has successfully paid down its debt, maybe it's innovating, it has some of that slack you mentioned, the temptation must be huge to move some of those people to other teams that are struggling, the ones falling behind. But Larson argues against that kind of top-down global optimization. Why is he against it?
It seems logical on the surface, right?
Yeah.
Move resources where they're needed most. But his core argument is strongly team first.
Team first.
He believes that sustained high productivity really comes from well-functioning, cohesive teams. And disrupting a team that's finally working well, even if you try to keep the individuals together but move them to a new problem space, it results in a significant dip in productivity. Why? Because it takes time for any new or reformed team to gel, to figure out how to work together effectively.
Right, the storming, norming, performing thing.
Exactly. Moving individuals around. Essentially resets that gelling process, especially if they're joining early-stage teams or teams with very different working cultures or code bases. Now, he's not saying teams should stay static forever, but the costs associated with reforming and reintegrating, those need to be really carefully weighed against the potential benefits.
So, breaking up a high-performing team might actually cause more harm than good in the bigger picture. Are there other reasons he gives for taking this team-first stance?
Yeah, he also highlights what he calls the fixed costs associated with most teams, particularly those responsible for ongoing products or services.
Fixed costs, like servers.
Not just servers, it includes things like essential maintenance, just keeping the lights on,
Hmm.
pre-existing contractual obligations maybe, ongoing support responsibilities. He argues that moving even one person from a well-oiled, innovating team can destabilize it, potentially pushing it back into a less productive state, like treading water, without necessarily providing a huge boost to the team receiving the new member, especially if that person needs time to ramp up. He uses that 8 engineers for sustainable on-call rule, again, as a good example of a kind of fixed cost that makes smaller teams much more vulnerable to disruption if someone leaves.
Okay. And what about that concept of slack again? How does that fit into this idea of not constantly shuffling people around?
Well, Larson argues that the common management desire to optimize for 100% resource utilization often completely overlooks the crucial role of slack, that spare capacity within a team.
Yeah, managers sometimes hate seeing people idle.
Right. But he points out, as a team's workload gets closer and closer to its maximum capacity, the time it actually takes to complete any new task increases dramatically, especially if there are dependencies on other overloaded teams.
Queuing theory, basically.
Exactly. And adding new members to an already overloaded team can sometimes even slow them down initially because it creates new communication overhead, coordination bottlenecks, onboarding needs. So he really advocates for the value of having some built-in slack. It allows teams to make local improvements, both small ones and bigger innovations, with minimal need for complex cross-team coordination.
Interesting.
He even suggests that teams with Slack can act as sort of organizational debuggers. If something's slow across the whole org, you can probably assume it's not the team that has some breathing room causing the problem.
That's a neat idea. Okay, so if just moving people around isn't the best answer when a team has capacity, what are the better alternatives according to Larson?
He suggests 2 main alternatives. Shift scope, rotate.
Shift, scope, rotate. Okay, what do those mean?
Shifting scope means gradually transferring responsibility for new tasks, or maybe even existing ones, to teams that actually have the available capacity. This avoids the disruption and the regelling costs you get from moving people. It also preserves the existing system dynamics more, which makes changes potentially easier to reverse if needed.
So move the work, not the people.
Essentially, yeah. The other approach is to rotate individuals into areas that need some temporary support, but for a clearly defined fixed period.
Like a temporary assignment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because the rotation is temporary, the individual keeps their original team identity, they know they're going back, they can focus on providing assistance without the pressure of fully integrating into a whole new team culture and code base long term. And, bonus, this can actually be a really valuable way to gauge how much real slack a team possesses. If you rotate someone out and the team barely notices, they probably had decent slack.
Ah, interesting test. He briefly mentions a swarming model, too. What was that about?
Yeah, he just notes that some organizations apparently have seen success with a more fluid swarming model, but at an organizational level. So engineers with the right skills temporarily converge on critical problems, work intensely, and then disperse again. It's different from just swarming within a single team. He mentions he hasn't personally experienced this model working in a sustained way, but he acknowledges it as another potential strategy out there. It just highlights that organizational design isn't one size fits all. There are multiple ways to tackle these things.
Right. Okay, let's shift gears a bit to a really big challenge, especially in tech, maintaining productivity when companies are growing incredibly fast. Hypergrowth. Larson draws a lot on his Uber and Stripe experiences here. What are some of the key problems he flags?
Oh yeah, he shares some pretty memorable anecdotes, like the saying at Uber, apparently that every 6 months it felt like a new company, and the related observation that our processes were always about 6 months behind our headcount. The fundamental issue, he argues, is that while real-world systems often have some natural self-correcting mechanisms, these just get completely overwhelmed. They become really inefficient when you're facing that sheer velocity and scale of hypergrowth.
He tries to quantify this too, right? With examples around integrating huge numbers of new engineers. What are the core challenges there?
Yeah, he really emphasizes the massive challenge of ramp-up time. Think about it. If you're doubling your engineering team every 6 months, and it takes, let's say, 6 to 12 months for a new engineer to become fully productive,
Uh-oh.
yeah, you quickly hit a point where the number of less experienced engineers, the ones still learning the ropes, far outweighs the seasoned veterans.
Yeah.
This puts a huge burden on those experienced engineers. They end up spending a massive chunk of their time just training, onboarding, answering questions, which inevitably slams their own output.
Right, the mentor tax.
Exactly. He even does some rough calculations showing how overall team productivity can be surprisingly low in these rapid growth phases. And that's not even counting the huge time suck of the hiring process itself. All the screenings, the interviews, the debriefs. That further drains the productivity of the existing team members who are involved.
So it's a double whammy.
Mhm.
New hires are initially less productive, and they drain capacity from your existing productive people. What other ripple effects of just adding lots of engineers does he mention?
He lists quite a few cascading consequences. As you get more engineers, you inevitably need new layers of management, right? Which adds complexity to communication, decision-making.
Hmm.
More engineers usually means more teams, which requires much more effort in cross-team coordination, alignment, avoiding stepping on toes.
Yeah.
The sheer volume of code changes and deployments goes way up, putting a huge strain on your development tools, your CI/CD pipelines, your infrastructure.
And more deployments often means
More outages, yeah. Given that many incidents are related to changes, higher deployment frequency often leads to more production incidents, which means you need more robust incident management processes, more people involved in fixing things. And finally, rapid growth often forces specialization of teams and systems, which means you end up with smaller on-call rotations for those specialized areas. That increases the frequency and the relative burden of on-call for individuals, and they need deeper knowledge of narrower systems.
Yeah.
He uses a kind of back-of-the-envelope math to show how overall efficiency tends to dip.
And he brings up this really interesting idea that systems survive one magnitude of growth. What does he mean by that in this hypergrowth context?
It's an observation that most systems, even if they were designed with scalability in mind initially, tend to hit significant limitations after they've grown by about 1 or 2 orders of magnitude, so 10x or 100x from their original design capacity.
Okay.
Now, if your user traffic or maybe your engineering team size is doubling every 6 months, that translates to an order of magnitude increase roughly every year and a half, which means you might find yourself needing to fundamentally re-architect or maybe even completely rewrite your core systems every, say, 3 years or so. And that's hugely risky, consumes massive engineering resources that could be building new features instead.
But he makes a counterintuitive point, right? He argues the system rewrites themselves aren't actually the biggest productivity killer. It's the migrations that come after. Why does he say that?
Yeah, that's interesting. He contends that poorly planned and executed migrations can stretch the negative impact of a system rewrite way beyond just the teams doing the rewrite. It can really impact the productivity of the entire surrounding organization.
How so?
Well, if each migration step takes a lot of time and effort, and especially if it can only be done by a small, already overloaded group of experienced engineers, the only ones who understand both the old and new systems, the cumulative drag on the whole organization's productivity can be absolutely massive and last for a long time.
Right. Everyone waiting on that one migration team.
Exactly. And he also points out that during these hypergrowth periods, organizations usually have other critical strategic projects happening at the same time, like expanding to new data centers, going active, launching in new international regions. All of these are competing for the same limited pool of experienced engineering talent needed for those tricky migrations.
Man, that sounds stressful. So what does Larson suggest as ways to try and manage this entropy, as he calls it, that comes with hypergrowth? He mentions the importance of finishing projects, referencing the Phoenix Project.
Yes, exactly. His key takeaway, echoing the Phoenix Project, is that value is only truly realized when work is actually completed and shipped. So to make any meaningful progress amidst the chaos of hypergrowth, it's absolutely critical to prioritize finishing initiatives rather than starting a ton of things and leaving them half done.
Stop starting, start finishing.
Pretty much. Regarding hiring, he goes back to that idea of focusing growth. Allow teams to alternate between periods of rapid hiring and then periods of consolidation and gelling. Ideally, aim to get teams to around that 8 engineer mark before you significantly shift the hiring focus away from them. He also suggests rotating engineers off interview duty periodically to prevent burnout, especially if they're doing, say, more than 3 interviews a week consistently. That adds up.
Good practical tip. What about all those constant interruptions, the shoulder taps, the Slack messages? They seem to plague engineers, especially in fast-moving companies.
Yeah, he advocates for strategies to channel those ad hoc interruptions into smaller, more manageable areas and then try to automate those areas as much as possible.
Like what?
Things like strongly encouraging ticketing systems for requests, creating internal knowledge bases, maybe chatbots, service cookbooks to answer common questions, even setting up specific on-call rotations just for handling general inquiries or support escalations.
But ask me anything rotation.
Sort of, yeah. He emphasizes training teams to respectfully but firmly push back on interruptions that come outside these established channels. And he highlights the huge value of maintaining a clear ownership registry, like who owns what system or service, so you can quickly find the right team or person instead of bothering random people.
That makes sense.
He also recommends that individuals just proactively block out focus time on their calendars. Defend that time to minimize disruption from random meeting requests.
And he really bangs the drum for documentation, doesn't he? Which often feels like the first casualty in rapid growth.
Absolutely. He views consistently available high-quality documentation as probably the most effective long-term solution for reducing those frequent interruptions. But he's realistic. He acknowledges it's really hard to bootstrap a good documentation culture in companies that haven't already prioritized it, especially once you get beyond, say, 20 engineers. He even wonders if any company that size really does it well consistently.
Yeah, it's a perennial challenge.
Yeah.
Finally, on hypergrowth, he touches on how software design itself can help manage the entropy.
Right. He recommends designing software with flexibility baked in. He uses this phrase fail open and layer policy.
Fail open, layer policy.
The idea is basically avoid hard-coding rigid policy decisions, things that are likely to change over time directly into the core system logic. Because if you do, changing the policy later might force an unnecessary and costly system rewrite.
Ah, separate policy from mechanism.
Exactly. And keeping the interfaces between different parts of your system generic and well-defined can also help. It might allow you to skip entire migration phases when you do need to re-implement a system, which means faster iteration, fewer compatibility headaches. He also cautions against the gatekeeper pattern, where one team or person becomes a bottleneck for all changes to a system. He sees that usually as an implementation bug, not a good control strategy.
Okay.
His closing thought on managing hypergrowth is really that it's about stacking up lots of small wins consistently, and that the skill of learning how to appropriately say no to new requests, that's crucial, but often really undervalued. Could be a whole chapter itself, probably.
Yeah, definitely. Wow, that paints a really vivid picture of the unique challenges, but also some potential solutions for managing in that kind of environment. Okay, let's move on to another really interesting concept Larson discusses. Organizational risk. How does he say that differs from organizational debt?
Yeah, it's a useful distinction. He describes organizational debt as like the accumulation of all those systemic issues that hinder an organization's long-term potential. Things like inconsistent or biased processes, maybe inequities in compensation. These problems tend to stick around because they rarely become the single most urgent fire that needs putting out today.
So slow burn issues.
Exactly. Organizational risk, on the other hand, he defines as a more volatile, more immediately threatening subset of that debt. These are the problems that are most likely to come due abruptly and cause significant immediate disruption.
Like what kind of things?
Things like a severely toxic team culture that's about to implode, a process that's so broken it leads to constant, toilsome fire drills, or maybe a key leader who is clearly struggling and failing in their role. It's the stuff that feels like it could blow up any minute. Think of organizational debt as maybe a poorly maintained road that just slows everyone down over time. Organizational risk is more like a bridge that's showing cracks and feels like it's about to collapse and cause immediate catastrophe.
Okay, that's a powerful analogy. So risk is the acute, potentially damaging stuff. How do these problems typically surface? How do leaders find out about them?
They often come up through various feedback channels in the organization. Informal chats between peers, maybe skip-level meetings where employees talk to their manager's manager, results from organizational health surveys, exit interviews sometimes. Leaders who are actively listening, paying attention, they'll likely become aware of these issues. But they can be really difficult and time-consuming to actually fix. And they have this nasty tendency to get worse over time if ignored, especially in bigger, more established organizations.
And Larson says how a leader responds to finding out about these risks is a core challenge of managing a large organization. What are some of the ineffective responses he's seen, maybe even done himself?
Yeah, he mentions several common reactions that ultimately don't work. Things like just ignoring the issues, hoping they'll magically go away, or becoming kind of apathetic or indifferent, like, what can I do? Or even leaders internalizing all the blame themselves, which can lead to their own burnout trying to fix everything at once. He's quite candid about having tried some of these approaches himself in the past and finding them, well, unsatisfying and unproductive.
So, what is his recommended approach then? How do you effectively manage this portfolio of risks?
His more successful approach, he says, involves proactively identifying just a few key areas of organizational risk that really need improvement right now. Then, actively tracking progress on addressing those specific areas. And here's the hard part. Consciously accepting that other areas, other known risks, might have to be managed less effectively or maybe just monitored in the meantime because you only have so much bandwidth.
Ruthless prioritization,
Pretty
essentially.
much. He stresses how important it is to work with your own manager to create a clear, explicit plan. Outline these priorities. Establish what reasonable progress actually looks like in those chosen areas. And for those other known risks, the ones you can't actively fix right now, he advises keeping them close.
Keep them close, meaning.
Meaning stay aware of them, don't forget about them, monitor them, but prioritize stabilizing one area at a time before moving on to the next big risk. He suggests maybe delegating risks that seem more easily solvable to others on your team, but personally retaining responsibility for the really complex, maybe intractable risks. As the leader, you're often best positioned to own those really tough ones.
Hmm.
And he concludes this section by pointing out something quite sobering, but also maybe freeing. As a leader, you will always have a portfolio of organizational risks. You will inevitably be underperforming in some important areas. And that's actually normal and unavoidable in a complex leadership role.
That's actually quite reassuring in a way. Okay, finally, let's discuss something that's just crucial for the long-term health of any organization. Succession planning. Larson frames this not just as some, corporate HR requirement, but as a real opportunity for personal growth too. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, he suggests that when you reach a point in your current role where your own rate of personal learning starts to plateau, which he thinks often happens after maybe 2 or 3 years in the same role,
Hmm.
that's not just a good time to think about your next career step, but it's also an ideal opportunity to engage in really thoughtful succession planning. This means consciously thinking about, okay, how would the organization keep functioning effectively if I weren't here doing this job anymore? Identifying any critical gaps in knowledge or responsibilities that only you handle, and then taking proactive steps to fill those gaps. He acknowledges it can feel a bit awkward sometimes to initiate these conversations, but he really views it as a fundamental skill for building a resilient, lasting organization. Plus, figuring out what you do helps you figure out what you could do next.
So it benefits the org and you. What are the specific steps Larson outlines for doing this effectively? He starts with what sounds like a surprisingly hard task, just figuring out what you actually do day to day.
Yes, step one is a thorough self-assessment of your current responsibilities, and it is harder than it sounds. He recommends looking at your work from a bunch of different angles, like review your calendar, what are the explicit meetings you attend, what are the more nuanced roles you play in those meetings. Analyze your non-meeting time, what fills that. Interviewing, coding, writing docs. Identify the recurring processes you're involved in, roadmap planning, performance reviews, headcount allocation. Think about how you directly support specific individuals on your team. Where are they relying on you? Track the kinds of inbound pings you get, chats, emails, what are people asking you for? Review your to-do list, both things you finished and things you keep postponing. And finally, map out your key external relationships who outside your immediate team do you interact with regularly.
Wow, that's comprehensive.
It is. And he suggests sharing this initial list with a few close colleagues you trust, just to sanity check it, make sure you haven't missed anything obvious. He jokes that just completing this exercise is a significant accomplishment, finally having a clear picture of your own job.
I believe it. Okay, so once you have that big list of everything you do, what's the next critical step?
Step two is to actively work to close the gaps. Go through your list. For each item, identify if there's someone in the organization who could readily take it over right now. If so, mentally cross it off that's covered.
Okay.
For the remaining items, the gaps, start brainstorming potential successors. Who could learn to do this? It might help to group similar responsibilities together here. Then he distinguishes between what he calls easy gaps. These are tasks that can probably be transitioned with just a bit of documentation or maybe a quick intro meeting, something you could likely close out in less than, say, 4 hours of effort.
Right, the low-hanging fruit.
Exactly. And then the riskiest gaps. These are the areas where maybe you possess truly unique expertise or others on the team currently lack the necessary skills, or the task itself is just critically important to the organization's success. Closing these gaps often requires ongoing effort over several months, mentoring, training, gradual handoffs.
Okay, easy versus risky gaps. Then what?
The final part of step 2 is to create a concrete plan. Your plan should aim to close all the identified easy gaps relatively quickly and tackle at least one or two of the riskiest gaps. Then, crucially, add these actions to your own personal goals, your development plan, talk to your manager about it, and boom, you've basically done succession planning.
And Larson emphasizes this isn't just a one-time thing you do when you're thinking of leaving, right? It should be more of an ongoing process.
Absolutely. He strongly advocates for making succession planning a regular exercise, maybe doing a review annually. This ongoing process helps you continuously identify new opportunities for delegation, which further strengthens the organization's overall capabilities. And importantly, it ultimately frees up your own time and energy so you can focus on new challenges and your own professional growth.
Keeps things dynamic.
Yeah. He even has a neat little tip. Use your vacation time as a sort of real-world test. See what processes or responsibilities maybe falter or cause confusion while you're out. That can give you some really valuable insights for what needs shoring up maybe the start of next year's succession planning list.
That's clever. Wow, this has been an incredibly valuable deep dive into Will Larson's An Elegant Puzzle. For you, our listener, the learner, maybe you came into this wanting to quickly grasp key concepts, avoid feeling overwhelmed. What are the absolute core takeaways you should pull from our discussion today?
Yeah, for the learner listening, I think the key insights are really these actionable frameworks we talked about. The principles of team sizing, they give you a clear rationale for thinking about how to structure effective engineering orgs. Understanding those 4 states of a team falling behind, treading water, etc., that offers a really valuable tool for diagnosing performance and applying targeted solutions. And the systematic approach to succession planning, seeing it not just as a corporate chore, but as a powerful mechanism for your own development and growth. Those are huge.
And what do you think might have been that real aha moment for our listener during this deep dive? Something that clicked?
I suspect the detailed reasoning behind those seemingly specific team size recommendations, 6 to 8 here, 4 to 6 there. The direct link he makes between team size and a manager's actual capacity for doing the important stuff like coaching, strategic thinking, coordination. I bet that provided a significant aha moment for many. It gives a concrete explanation for what might have previously just felt like arbitrary numbers people throw around.
Yeah, the why behind the number. So how can the learner take some of these concepts and immediately apply them? Maybe walking into a meeting tomorrow, or just trying to understand their own organization better, or even thinking about their career path.
Well, they could start by just evaluating the team structures they see around them against Larson's guidelines. Are there managers struggling with way more than 8 direct reports? Are there super small teams that might be more vulnerable than they look on the org chart? Thinking about their own team, or maybe adjacent teams, through the lens of those 4 states falling behind, treading water, repaying debt, innovating that can provide immediate clarity on current challenges and maybe potential areas for improvement. And just on a personal level, simply reflecting on their own role using that succession planning framework, asking what exactly do I do all day? That alone can reveal surprising insights and maybe opportunities for delegation and personal growth they hadn't considered.
Great starting points. Okay, finally, as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a thought for you, our listener, to maybe mull over. Thinking about that concept of organizational risk we discussed, what's maybe one potential risk you might identify within your current sphere of influence, however small, that you could perhaps start to address proactively, even in a small way, tomorrow?
Or maybe looking beyond just the ideal team sizes we talked about, what do you believe are the most critical underlying human dynamics, the intangible stuff, that really contribute to a team's long-term gelling and achieving that sustained high performance?
Lots to think about. This has just been the starting point, hopefully, of your deeper understanding.
Thanks for listening. Visit our library and subscribe below for more book summaries. This has been a Sprint Reads production.